This is lecture Reproductive 2. We're going to start this by talking about female gametogenesis, the creation of eggs, and we'll then get into the menstrual cycle, the control system by which the release of those eggs is controlled and the uterus is prepared for the implantation of a fertilized egg. We'll talk a little bit about male gametogenesis and the creation of sperm. We'll then get into fertilization and implantation. And then finally, we'll talk about contraception, ways to prevent fertilization when people don't want it to happen. All right, let's talk about female gametogenesis. So gametes, as we mentioned, are egg and sperm. So the process of gametogenesis is the process by which they're made. And just to remind everyone, we looked at the idea of meiosis, which was the process by which we went from a diploid cell, one that had 2 copies of every chromosome. If you remember in meiosis, each of those chromosomes duplicated. Then we went through one division, where we separated the duplicated chromosomes, and then each of those went through a second division, separating those duplicated chromosomes, producing 4 haploid gametes. This is the theoretical idea of meiosis, where we go from a diploid cell to 4 haploid gametes. In female gametogenesis in humans, the same principle applies, but there's an important distinction. So let's go over kind of an overview how that's going to work, and then we'll talk about the details. So in the human female, at birth, you start with about 500,000 of these kind of primordial theoretical eggs. What we can call primary oocytes in the ovary. And each ovary has about 500,000 of them. Before birth, around 5 months of gestation, they have duplicated their DNA. So they have their 46 pairs of chromosomes, but each of those chromosomes is now a doubled one where it's been duplicated. But then instead of going on to the next cell division, they pause there. And they can stay in that pause state for 50 years or so sometimes. But all of them pause before birth, about 5 months gestation. And then, a little before puberty, every month, a new set of them begins a maturation process. That maturation process is actually going to take more like a year. So every month, a set that began its maturation process about almost a year ago enters a final maturation process. And that's what we usually think of as happening in the menstrual cycle, is that you've got a batch that's been maturing for almost a year, and then it completes that cycle in that final couple of weeks before ovulation. But let's go back to this. So those primary oocytes, they stay in that paused state, and then they start their development, taking about a year, staying in that state. When we get to the final maturation process, these primary oocytes compete with each other for resources. We'll talk about that. But in the end, usually just one of them, sometimes more than one of them, reach maturity. And just before ovulation, they're actually going to go through the first meiotic division, where they separate into these 2 cells. However, in that first meiotic division in humans, one of those 2 cells, the division is unequal. It actually looks more like this, where one of the cells gets the majority of the resources, and the other is really just a little offshoot with just the chromosomes of one of those sets of chromosomes. That one we're going to call the first polar body. And it doesn't have any known function. It just degenerates, disintegrates. This one, the other one that's produced, is the secondary oocyte. That's what gets ovulated. That's what actually leaves the ovary and enters into the body. Now this one starts its second division. We sort out the chromosomes and we sort of sort them out into two things that are not nuclei, but have the potential to be. And then again, we wait. So this is what gets ovulated. This is what's coming through the fallopian tube. If it gets fertilized by a sperm cell, that sperm cell will add a chromosome to this. That sperm nucleus will fuse with one of these two. When it does, let's say the one here on the left, that now becomes a diploid nucleus. This then undergoes the second division. And again, it's an unequal division. One of them gets that diploid nucleus, the other gets the remaining haploid nucleus, and this one, the second polar body, is non-functional. It serves no known purpose. The one that got the full nucleus is the zygote. That's the thing. That's the fertilized egg that has the potential to develop into a human being. So, when we talk about gametes in human females, where exactly the gamete part is a little bit hard to say, because at no point do we end up with those 4 haploid gametes. This is the thing that's ovulated. It's partway through the process of meiosis. What gets fertilized is one of the nuclei. So in a way, that nucleus is the gamete. However, we usually talk about this being the gamete, because that's the thing that the other gamete is going to attach to. So, in any case, when we talk about ovulating an egg, this, the secondary oocyte, is the thing that gets ovulated. These are the things that you find in the ovary, primary oocytes. So, that's the idea of female gametogenesis. Now, the process by which this is governed, how we know to start a set of that maturation and then after about a year do the final maturation of that group, that's governed by a fairly complicated interplay of hormones that produces the menstrual cycle. That menstrual cycle is also responsible for preparing the uterus so that if we get a fertilized zygote, it has a place where it can bind to the uterine wall and develop the structures that are going to allow it to get nutrition and support from the mother while it develops into a human. So, let's talk about that menstrual cycle, about how we have that interplay of hormones that governs both ovulation and the preparation of the uterus, and if no fertilized egg happens, the shedding of the uterus. Okay, so here's how we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle. I've set up a template here, so I've divided this into time. This is starting at 0 days, going to 28 days. By definition, when we're talking here, the 0 day is the day on which menstrual bleeding begins. So this area, we're going to talk about the endometrium, which is the lining of the tissue that lines the uterus, that provides a place for a fertilized egg to implant. In this area, we're going to talk about the hormones produced by the ovaries. So these are the ovarian hormones. Here we're going to be talking about 2 of them, estrogen and progesterone. And up here, we're going to be showing levels of the pituitary hormones. Those are follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. As we talk about this process of the menstrual cycle, we're going to be talking about follicles a lot. And so I thought it would probably be a good idea to start a sketch here showing you what a follicle was and how that works. So to begin with, the follicles that you get in the early ovary before birth really they're called sometimes primordial follicles. And they really just consist of the primary oocyte surrounded by a layer of support cells. In this case, we don't need to talk about that right now. But in that process of maturation, every month we select a new set of these primordial follicles to start maturing. And as they do that, they start growing and some of the cells around them start changing. So this follicle starts to become something where you've got your oocyte, but now it's surrounded by a more complicated set of cells. Pretty soon we get a difference here between what are called thecal cells, which form the outer layer, and granulosa cells, which form this inner layer. So these are the granulosa cells. This in here is the oocyte, and these out here are the thecal cells. That eventually starts forming a larger structure where there's a fluid-filled area on the inside. So we've got our granulosa cells, and we've got our oocyte, and then we've got a fluid-filled area here called the antrum. So this is the state that our follicles are in when they begin this process, the final maturation process that we'll talk about in the menstrual cycle. The purpose of these thecal and granulosa cells is to secrete, at this point, mostly estrogen, which is going to be an important part of this process. Later on, these granulosa cells will switch from making so much estrogen and make more progesterone, but we'll get to that. All right, so our menstrual cycle starts when menstrual bleeding begins. So that's going to be when our endometrial lining begins to shed. So we'll show that with this red indicating the bleeding. We're going to show that lasting for a few days, maybe 3 days. So that indicates that bleeding happening over these first roughly 3 days. Now, during that period, we begin to get the secretion of a little bit of follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, from the anterior pituitary. So we'll draw that line, which was starting low, but it's now starting to be a little bit higher. Now, compare that to LH, which is still very, very low at this point. So here in these first couple days of the cycle, the anterior pituitary is starting to secrete noticeable amounts of follicle-stimulating hormone, but luteinizing hormone is really pretty much just at more or less zero. At this point, progesterone is just about at its zero mark after the previous menstrual cycle. So our progesterone levels are starting low, but our estrogen levels, as this follicle-stimulating hormone starts to encourage the maturation of those follicles to their final stages, estrogen levels are starting to go up. So that's the stage at the start of our menstrual cycle. This small rise in follicle-stimulating hormone is what's triggering the final maturation of a group of generally somewhere around less than 10 of these follicles that have been maturing for most of a year, and now they're in that antrum. They've got that fluid-filled area. Now they're going to have about 10 of them do their final maturation process. And they start effectively competing for this follicle-stimulating hormone. That FSH is what encourages them to grow. So as they grow, they secrete more of the estrogen. So FSH continues to rise for a little bit here, whereas LH is going to remain very, very low at this point. And as those follicles grow, they're secreting a little more estrogen. Progesterone levels are staying very low. Now, it's worth noting here that this estrogen is a suppressor of FSH and LH and of GnRH from the hypothalamus. So in that whole HPG axis, this estrogen is acting to limit this. So it doesn't let it get too high. That estrogen is going to cause this to sort of plateau, sort of like that. Now, luteinizing hormone is still going to remain low at this point. But as our follicles grow, and as we get toward about the middle, about day 7 of this first 2 weeks, only a few follicles are left, but the ones that are left are secreting increasing amounts of estrogen. Progesterone is staying low. All right, So that's how these hormones interacting. In this first week of the menstrual cycle, as the follicles grow and they're competing with each other, they are producing more and more estrogen, which is limiting the rising amount of FSH being produced by the pituitary. Now, as to what's happening with the uterine lining, this estrogen is a signal to the uterine lining to begin to replicate. So we had just shed much of the uterine lining, but what's left now starts to grow more. So we start to see more of this uterine lining beginning to grow during this time. All right, and that takes us up to about the first week after bleeding begins. So during this time, some of those growing follicles are dying off. Some of them are losing the battle, but the ones that are winning are growing more and more. They actually start to push the FSH levels down just a touch by the end of that first week. Alrighty, so here we are on day 7 of the menstrual cycle. Now, as we move into this second week, by the time we get to about day 10, really only one of those follicles will be left. Generally, only one of them makes it to the final maturation, although every once in a while you'll get 2, or extremely rarely even more, which is how you can sometimes get multiple ovulations. But usually it's just 1. So as we get toward the later part of this, estrogen levels continue to rise. They're really rising quite high. And a funny thing happens as they really reach their peak. As they rise high enough, estrogen changes from being a suppressor of FSH and LH to starting to be an activator for both GnRH and LH secretion. So as we're making more estrogen, what it looks like there's actually 2 estrogen receptors on the pituitary. One of them, which responds well even to low levels of estrogen, suppresses the production of FSH and LH. But there's a second receptor which doesn't respond well until there's a lot of estrogen, but when it does respond, it strongly encourages the production of FSH and LH. Which means that as these estrogen levels rise toward their peak, LH especially is going to start experiencing an increase. And as we get toward this mark here, toward the end of the second week, this becomes almost a positive feedback loop. And the LH undergoes kind of a spike right around day 14. FSH doesn't have quite the same response. It'll have a smaller response, a little bit of a peak, but not as much. And even at the end, as estrogen rises and LH starts rising, some of the follicular cells start to secrete a little bit of progesterone. So that's going to start picking up a little there toward the end. So this is where we're building up to our peak right around day 14. Now, our endometrial lining has been growing during this time. So we're growing and thickening that endometrial lining. And then as progesterone starts showing up, progesterone starts to cause the growth of some interesting blood vessels in the endometrial lining, some vessels which are going to be involved in making it a better place for a fertilized egg to implant. So at this point, as we're getting here toward the end of the second week, this is where our final follicle, so at this point there's basically one follicle left, sometime around day 10. And as this LH surges, that one follicle undergoes its first meiotic division. And becomes a secondary oocyte. That's happening about here, just as this LH starts to surge. And as that LH reaches its peak, right around day 14, that triggers the rupture of the last follicle and the expulsion of that secondary oocyte, which produces ovulation. Right here around day 14. That's when ovulation occurs. I've heard doctors say that ovulation that women don't feel it, there's nothing associated with it. I've had a lot of women tell me that's nonsense and they can absolutely feel when they ovulate. I tend to believe the women. So that comes as a result of this surge in LH. That rapid rise in LH triggers the process that produces ovulation. Keep that in mind. You'll want to know what it is that causes ovulation. Now, once ovulation happens, that follicle ruptures. Let me quickly go back to our follicle diagram. So when ovulation occurs, we've grown this into a substantial thing by that point, where we've got a big fluid-filled area, the antrum. This is now, by that point, this is now a secondary oocyte, and we've got our granulosa cells and our thecal cells on the outside. When this finally ruptures at ovulation, so we'll sketch that in like this. Our secondary oocyte comes out along with a few of these granulosa cells. The follicle that's left, the remaining thecal and granulosa cells, don't just go away. They actually become a particular structure known as the Corpus Luteum. So this is where ovulation happens. After ovulation, the remainder of the follicle still there in the ovary becomes the corpus luteum, and that's actually going to have an important role to play here. So let's go back to our diagram of the menstrual cycle. Okay. Now, our secondary oocyte has been released. The follicle becomes the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum's main job is to secrete lots and lots of progesterone. So progesterone levels now really start to take off. And they rise quite high. At the same time, they produce less estrogen. So estrogen levels decline pretty rapidly. They're going to come back up in a little bit here. Now, progesterone is a strong suppressor of FSH and LH. So as that progesterone rises, these drop down to virtually nothing. So that's coming as a result of this rising progesterone. Now, the progesterone causes us to continue to grow this uterine lining, but it also causes the uterine lining that we're growing to grow more and more of these distinctive spiral blood vessels that enrich the uterine lining and make it suitable for a fertilized egg to implant. So that's what's going on here in the first week after ovulation, roughly. That the rising levels of progesterone are suppressing FSH and LH down to virtually nothing. Estrogen levels fall off, but then come back some, as that corpus luteum does secrete some estrogen. So we'll have that estrogen level come back some here. That takes us to about day 21. Now, here we're just about optimally set up for the implantation of a fertilized egg, if there's going to be one. If it's going to happen, it will probably happen right in here somewhere. However, if it doesn't, starting around day 26 or so, that corpus luteum starts to rapidly drop off progesterone secretion. And estrogen is going to follow suit, dropping off with it. Now, as that happens, it's that progesterone that's maintaining this uterine lining. So as the progesterone levels fall off, those blood vessels start to die, and this uterine lining starts to become kind of unstable, which is what's going to cause it at about day 28, which is the same as day 0, to start to shed, which is where we'll get our menstrual bleeding. So as we head toward the very end of this cycle, progesterone, as the corpus luteum goes away, drops off, estrogen drops off, while luteinizing hormone remains pretty low at this point. FSH will start to rise a little bit. That happens because as we lose the progesterone and estrogen, that stops suppressing the pituitary, which allows it to make a little more FSH. That new rise in FSH is going to trigger the final maturation of the next batch of follicles, which is going to lead us to the beginning of the cycle again. So, this is kind of how the whole thing works. Just to very quickly go back over it. On the day of bleeding, we have very low levels of progesterone and very low levels of estrogen, which is allowing the anterior pituitary to secrete more FSH. That's what triggers the final maturation of the first set of follicles. The endometrial lining is bleeding and falling off at this point. As FSH rises, that causes the continuing development of the first follicles, whose outer layers, the thecal and granulosa cells, are producing estrogen. That rising estrogen causes the new endometrial lining to grow here. That's going on through about the first week after bleeding starts. During that second week, we start to lose other follicles, but one or occasionally two remain. As estrogen levels rise very high, that triggers several things to happen. The one follicle that's left, that one oocyte in there, goes through its first meiotic division and becomes a secondary oocyte. That rising estrogen also starts to trigger an increase in LH secretion rather than suppressing it, leading us to this spike in LH and to a lesser degree FSH. That spike causes that last follicle, the dominant follicle, to rupture, causing the release of the secondary oocyte, which is the event of ovulation. The remainder of the follicle becomes the corpus luteum, which starts secreting a lot of progesterone. That progesterone causes the continuing development of the endometrium, plus the growth of special blood vessels, which will make that endometrium well suited for an implanted fertilized egg. And that's what we're getting ready for in this week and optimally ready for right around here. If no egg implants, after a little while, the corpus luteum begins to recede and it starts making less progesterone and estrogen. That lack of progesterone causes those blood vessels to start to die off, which makes the endometrial lining start to die. And right about day 28, we will start to shed that endometrial lining and we'll start menstrual bleeding again. As estrogen and progesterone fall off, that releases the inhibition, and FSH especially starts to show up again. So that's the menstrual cycle. Probably the most important event in here is this ovulation that's triggered by the LH surge. And a number of contraceptive methods are involved in targeting and preventing that ovulation, but we'll get to that. What we're going to get to now, we're going to talk a little bit about male gametogenesis, how sperm are made, and then we'll come back to this when we talk about what happens after fertilization, if fertilization occurs.